afternoon to everyone. I think it's time to start the afternoon work. So could you please take your seat? We want to start with the policy item updated policy on environmental and social safeguards. Right? Yes. So I would like to invite Francois to introduce the paper. Go ahead, Francois.
Thank you, Naoko. The Council, at its 53rd meeting in November 2017, requested the Secretariat to present an updated policy on environmental and social safeguards for consideration at its 55th meeting in December 2018. The GEF's current policy on environmental and social safeguards dates back to 2011, when the Council decided to pilot, at the time, an expansion of the GEF partnership. And following the approval of the policy, the GEF additional 10 agencies were assessed against the new minimum safeguard standards, and the standards were applied in the accreditation of 8 new agencies. Since 2015, all 18 agencies have been in compliance with applicable standards. In 2017, IO reviewed the policy and found it had catalyzed safeguard development in many agencies, and in a number of cases prompted agencies to adopt their first comprehensive safeguard policy frameworks. Unlike some peer institutions, however, the GEF does not have requirements in place for monitoring and reporting on safeguards implementation. In addition, a comparison with more recently adopted frameworks suggests a number of possible gaps in coverage. So, in response to IO's findings and following the Council's request, the Secretariat has led a consultative process to further review and update the safeguards policy in line with international best practices. The process has benefited greatly from the input provided by agencies and from the multi-stakeholder working group on environmental and social safeguards, which includes several Council members. And based on these conclusions, the proposed policy retains key features of the GEF's current approach while introducing several important changes. So what are those changes? Well, first, a similarity. In line with current policy, the proposed policy sets forth minimum standards that agencies would be required to meet using their own policies, procedures, and systems. So we're not prescribing safeguard policies, we're setting minimum standards. At the same time, the proposed policy includes new requirements for the documentation of and the reporting on environmental and social risks and potential impacts and their management throughout the GEF project and program cycles. In line with the current approach, agencies would be responsible for the systematic identification, assessment, management, and monitoring of environmental and social risks and impacts. But in addition, the proposed policy sets out a role for the Secretariat in the review of projects and programs, for the availability, clarity, and completeness of the information requested at the various stages of the project and program cycle, and the monitoring of and reporting on safeguards implementation at the portfolio level. In addition, the proposed updated policy expands and strengthens the minimum standards in line with good international practices. New areas addressed in the proposed policy include, inter alia, labor and working conditions, community health, safety and security, climate and disaster risks, disability inclusion, disadvantaged or vulnerable individuals or groups, and adverse gender-related impacts, including gender-based violence and sexual exploitation and abuse. Additionally, the proposed policy also strengthens protection for indigenous people. And in the proposed policy, all minimum standards would apply to all agencies. The Secretariat proposes that the updated policy come into effect on July 1st, 2019, and that it apply to all new projects and programs submitted for GEF financing on or after the date of effectiveness. For projects under implementation, the Secretariat proposes that the policy apply to all midterm reviews and terminal evaluations submitted after 1 year from the date of effectiveness, which would be July 2020. Following Council approval, the Secretariat would update project templates consistent with the new project-level documentation requirements. In addition, the Secretariat, in consultation with the working group, would finalize guidelines to support, first, the assessment of agencies against the proposed minimum standards, and second, the application of the proposed project and program-level documentation and reporting requirements. The Secretariat would then facilitate an assessment of all agencies against the proposed minimum standards starting in 2019, and it would present the findings of the assessment to the Council in the fall of 2019. After the initial assessment, agencies' compliance will be subject to periodic monitoring consistent with the 2016 policy on monitoring agencies' compliance. As per the proposed policy, the Secretariat would report annually to the Council on the implementation, including the type and level of environmental and social risks and impacts identified in GEF finance projects and programs, the management of such risks and impacts during project implementation, and at project completion, as well as cases reported to and addressed by agencies' accountability, grievance, and conflict resolution mechanisms. So this is the summary of the proposed changes to the existing framework. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. I'm sorry for my cough. It's a souvenir from Katowice. So now, floor is open for your comments and questions. Marita first.
Thank you, Naoko. Let me start by saying that we really appreciate the very transparent and consultative process that you arranged during the past year. It was very, very positive. You were accessible. We could provide written comments, and I think it was a good process. And we welcome and support this proposal. And of course, especially the inclusion of gender equality now in safeguards. We would like to draw your attention to the decision at the CBD COP 14 regarding safeguards in biodiversity financing mechanisms. And we think it would be appropriate for the GEF to take the Convention's voluntary guidelines into account in implementing these safeguards. Coming back to the timing when we see presentation of this safeguard analysis and screening, as we suggested during the consultation process, we think it's of utmost importance to identify as early as possible potential environmental and climate and social risks in the project cycle and prepare a mitigation plan. What is suggested now in the policy is that the PIF is foreseen to include indicative risks and mitigation plans, and that a more developed analysis will not be presented until closer to the CEO endorsement. We think this is a step in the right direction. But in some instances, that it should be possible to include actual risks also at that stage. I realize it's not always possible, but I think it's possible in some cases. And And I think it would be useful to hear not only from the Secretariat, but also from, if there are implementation agencies present, to say whether this is impossible to do. I think it is possible, so I think we should aim for having this kind of plan or screening, identification of potential risks as early as possible. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Marita. May I call on Peter from Australia, followed by Carola from Netherlands.
Thank you, Naoko, and thank you, Françoise, for stepping out the work of the Secretariat on these very, very important issues. We are happy to welcome the policy. I think it's indicative of the high level of commitment that has been shown by the Secretariat and by the full GEF partnership to ensure safeguards are considered and managed and, importantly, monitored throughout. And I think the monitoring of the impact of safeguards should be something that's very much kept as a live issue, reporting back to Council. Also pleased to hear the reference to minimum standards, and obviously where implementing partners have higher level standards, these should not be seen as a get-out to reduce down. We want to continue to lift standards wherever they are. I want just to make one point, solely speaking as on behalf of Australia at this point, and that's with regard to asbestos. Australia has an absolute ban on the use and procurement of asbestos and asbestos-containing material, including in our overseas aid programme investments. And consequently, nationally feel an obligation to raise this issue here and to encourage the GEF and all partners to consider including policy or text around asbestos use if possible. And I understand that this is not a universal standard, but we would like again to push the standards a little further if we can. And if the Council is willing, we are happy to work with the Secretariat on a couple of perhaps textual amendments that would sit within this draft. So happy to do that offline. So back to representing the seat on child protection, obviously a significant issue. We just want to ensure that any policies we're putting in place or any instructions that the agencies and indeed the GEF itself has the capacity to manage the risks to children. There are high standards and the ability to actually deliver those will be a measure of the policy. We are also pleased to hear and see in the paper that all these safeguards, including child safe practices, will apply to all organisations who are members of the GEF. And perhaps a more specific statement or a more specific commitment in the introduction would strengthen the document in that regard. We, similarly on the capacity of staff, we would like to see the policy specify that investigations into child protection or child safety are undertaken by suitably trained staff, especially investigations concerning children. And again, there may be scope, we can work offline on this, to include a reference somewhere in the document to that. Two last and sort of quick points. One is just to draw attention to the guidance that I think has been now settled at both the UNFCCC COP and also the CBD COP with regard to reviewing and, if necessary, updating or adopting policies for the prevention of sexual harassment and for the abuse of authority with the aim of protecting staff of the GEF, Secretariat, as well as its partner organisations. There may be scope in this document to immediately respond to that guidance, but if not here, we would like and expect to see a reflection of that very soon after the guidance has been formally received. And the final thing is congratulating you on this next iteration, if we can be so bold as to propose the next development, possibly the specific policy or specific guidance around the support for vulnerable peoples. A vulnerable peoples policy, perhaps, could be something that we start to think about in the next development of our safeguards policy. But again, coming back to my opening point, very strong welcome for the policy, very strong commendation for the commitment that the Secretariat shows with regard to these very, very important facets of our work. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. May I call on Carola, followed by Jos from UK.
Thank you, Naoko. Very much in the same vein as the two previous speakers, we think it's very important that this work is done and applied, and very much appreciate that Françoise mentioned these are the floors and not the ceilings that we're talking about. We also welcome very much that a number of entirely new minimum standards is included, and that the process through which this document was built was so transparent and inclusive. Especially would like to commend that standard number 1 includes provisions on sexual exploitation and abuse, and that this is addressed really at the overarching organizational level and not as a chapter or an issue that you deal with separately, but that it's really like cross-cutting addressed. That's very well done. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yes, thanks very much. It's right that GEF remains abreast of the best on these questions, and so we're pleased to see you've done that. But I've got two amendments I'd like to make to the decision. And the first is to do with making sure that it's understood that these standards apply throughout the implementation chain, from implementing agencies through AEs and ultimately to the project implementation. I recall that there may be provision for that in previous GEF policy, but I don't see any reason why we shouldn't highlight it here. And the second relates to the potential reputational risk that may arise in cases of suspected non-compliance with one or more of these standards, and that the reporting interval of annual in the AMR, whilst appropriate from a governance point of view, is not always appropriate from an information management point of view, and we will need more up-to-date and faster turnaround on this matter, and I've talked informally about that with Peter Lallis already in the Secretariat. So with those two items in mind, I'd like to propose that that the decision text reads, the Council, having reviewed the document, as in the document at the moment, and then we add, as they apply to IAs and EAs under their supervision, approves. And then a new paragraph. Further, Council requests that the Secretariat to devise a procedure to inform Council of possible non-compliance with the standards where these may impose reputational risk on the GEF by the 56th meeting. I can give you a scribbled version of that later if it meets the approval of colleagues. Thank you.
Thank you, Jos. May I call on Conrad, followed by Matthew.
Thank you. We very much welcome this updated policy. We think that it contains the necessary standards that are also correspondent also to the standards of the new World Bank policy on this matter, and we also particularly appreciate the inclusion of gender-based violence and sexual exploitation and abuse issues. Any policy is as good as its implementation and the monitoring of its compliance, and that is a bit our main concern with regard to this policy. The Secretariat plans to report to the Council on a yearly basis. Nevertheless, we're wondering whether such a report will really reflect a thorough follow-up and risk portfolio analysis. What happens if the compliance with the standards cannot be ensured by the countries or eventually the agencies? Does the Secretariat and the agencies dispose of sufficient specialized staff to monitor implementation and compliance? And are there plans for capacity building in the countries? The World Bank is doing such capacity building. Is the plan to hook up to such efforts? So all this compliance, actually this matter of implementation of monitoring seems to us to be very crucial, and we very much share also what just said, the reputation risk that we are running in this regard, and we also very much support a proactive attitude of the Secretariat to the Council to report on cases that are occurring of non-compliance or of serious suspicion of non-compliance. Thank you.
Thank you. May I call on Matthew, followed by Lauren?
Thank you very much. So I agree with much of what's been said by the previous speakers. You know, it is certainly essential that we have an up-to-date policy on environmental and social safeguards, that our policy reflects where international best practice is, and we welcome the proposal that you put forward and strongly support it and thinks it brings us where we need to be. I'll just also note that I support Joss's two proposals and would also certainly emphasize the second one, that it's important that we be informed on as frequent a basis as needed as issues arise, which could affect the reputation of the GEF. So would just put our weight behind that as well. Thank you.
Thanks much. May I call on Lauren, followed by Apana?
Thank you, Chair. And thank you for these revised safeguards and for the process, which we also feel was very, very good. And we're happy to see our comments included in the final version. We would like to completely support the two suggestions made by the UK. We had exactly the same points. So I hope you will be able to act on that. We would also like to echo the comment made by Switzerland on the human resources. If you're going to do more reporting on the Secretariat side on safeguards, we have a question: do you have sufficient human resources and capacity to do such reporting? So that would be good to get some clarification on. And finally, in terms of guidelines, we believe that you will be developing relevant guidelines now, and that the working group will continue working on this issue, and we would be happy to join that work. And we believe that it would be important to develop these guidelines as soon as possible in order to implement the new policy. And so we wonder if you have any dates for when the guidelines will be finalized. Thank you.
Thank you. May I call on Apana, followed by Kojuran?
Thank you, Naoko. As a global body that specifically deals with environmental issues, we are happy that GEF proposes to maintain high standards with respect to environmental and social safeguards. As has been mentioned, these are minimum safeguards, and if the implementing agency has higher safeguards or more stringent conditionalities to be met, I believe in the project that would be the standards that would be applicable. I may be assured on how this will be actually executed. Second, we also welcome the proposed changes, as it will offer an opportunity for the Secretariat to work with the countries and the GEF agencies to foster learning and knowledge sharing on safeguards across all the partners, so that all of them have a common understanding of the safeguards that will be applicable for GEF programs. Third, we have had some experience both at the country levels as well as in other MDBs, and we find that safeguards necessarily are not static documents, but often there is work that needs to be done on issuing operational guidelines, which can be quite critical. So I will second the suggestion made by Norway, by Lauren, that this is something that we look forward to, and we would appreciate if the work on guidelines is also done in a consultative manner. And finally, the paragraph 4 in the document, which refers to application, it says that for GEF-financed projects and programs under implementation, the policy applies to all midterm reviews and terminal evaluations submitted after 1 year from the date of effectiveness, that is from 1st July 2020. So we would like to be assured on what are the implications of this applicability, and whether there are any cost factors, and if so, how they will be taken into account. So with these few comments, we commend the update and also wish the Secretariat and all partners that they should be able to work together to ensure that this is translated on the ground.
Thank you so much. May I call on Kojura, followed by CSO representative.
I would like to join the others in welcoming the updated environmental and social safeguards, and also the inclusion of these safeguards in the supporting monitoring system. We have a few questions and suggestions. As I think it was Jaws who already raised it, we would like to have a clarification on how much the guidelines also apply to the execution chain, including financial intermediaries. And then we would like some clarification about why the Standard 4 excludes safeguards on land acquisition, which is included in the current World Bank Group Environmental and Social Safeguards Framework. And we would also like to suggest that the standard on sound management of chemicals should be extended beyond the limitation on dealing with pesticides, hazardous materials, and banned and restricted chemicals. And we are ready to connect with our experts to discuss this option. On the rest, I just joined the others, so that we are looking forward to operationalizing the guidelines and applying them in real life.
Thank you, Kojura. May I call on CSO representative, followed by Paola from Italy.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The indigenous community of the CSO networks welcomes the step taken by the GF to improve the existing safeguards policy, including an issue concerning the potential impacts of GF projects on indigenous people, local communities, women, youth, and vulnerable groups. We support the proposed decision to review agencies' compliance with the proposed policy and to review and monitor the applicants of the safeguards. We also welcome the guidelines for the application of the proposed policy will be updated and encourage GEF to meaningfully engage indigenous people, local communities, and CSO throughout their development and implementation, both within and beyond the multi-stakeholder working group on environmental and social safeguards. We also find that proposed policy should be improved on a number of points and request the GEF Council to take these comments into account in finalization of the proposed policy, or to take note for them for any subsequent revision of the policy and for inclusion in the guidelines to be produced. Our recommendations include for the following: ensure that review the monitoring of safeguards compliance consider both agency policy and practice and is undertaken with the full and effective participation of involvement and impacted indigenous people and local communities. Specify to the greatest possible extent the social and environmental risk threshold beyond which projects will not be approved for or funded and which justify the no project alternatives. 4.B, and specify the GF financial projects should not be contravene applicable international human rights instruments in line with the reference to international environmental treaties and agreement in Annex 1, paragraph 7B. Specify the responsive actions that will be taken, including women and by whom, in the case of agency, government, or other actors' non-compliance with safeguards. Ensure safeguards are implementing in ways consist with and complementary of the whole set of GF policies, principles, and guidelines. Recognize and engage indigenous, traditional, and local experts, particularly women. Ensure definitions adhere to the strongest and most broadly accepted definition in international convention and agreements, including both respect to free, prior, and informed consent and the meaning of indigenous people, referring to the UNDRIP, ILO 169, Martinez Kobo study. In the definition of restrictions on land use, add including territories, water and water resources at the end of the sentence, restrictions and access to other common property resources. Proactively support opportunities and capacities of indigenous people, local communities, CSOs, agencies, governments, and others to claim rights and uphold their respective roles and responsibilities in relation to the safeguards, example, through information and knowledge sharing. Consider the project risks and threats to indigenous people and local communities, own collective actions on conservation. Recognize women's land rights as well as claims to land or assets that are recognized or recognizable under a customary law in addition to national law. Ensure grievance mechanism and other relevant intercultural processes respect and engage local and customary institutions. Consider emerging knowledge and experience of the potential impacts and risks of the use and patenting of the genetic resources and include safeguards protections against the impacts of biopiracy. With regard to adverse gender-related impacts, recognize and address the risks of LGBTIQ persons as well. Thank you. We will also submit more detailed comments in writing to the GEF Secretary and Council. Thank you.
Thank you so much. May I call on Paola, followed by Anna from Canada.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. We too welcome and very much support this update to the safeguards for an organization like the GEF and the kind of business we are in. It's important that we keep standards as high as possible, keeping in mind, as others have noted, that these are to be considered minimum standards. So if agencies have higher standards, those should apply, of course. Just support Conrad's comments on a policy being as good as its implementation and monitoring, so making sure that we have the right capacity and mechanism in place to ensure its compliance and implementation, and very much support Joseph's comment on the need to apply this provision throughout the implementation chain and a mechanism of sort of an early warning whether there is a potential for reputational risk for the GF and support reflecting this aspect in the decision. One final specific point on the minimum standard number 6 concerning cultural heritage. We think it's especially important that standards in this field are high, again, for the kind of business the GEF is in, which is all about sustainability and sustainable development. So particularly what is under point B, the sentence that says that assessing whether destruction or damage can be avoided, we would suggest and actually very much recommend that this be strengthened and turned around a little bit, making it an obligation for GEF finance projects to consider feasible alternative project design, including reciting, rerouting, to avoid damaging or distracting cultural heritage. And with that, we are pleased to support this update. Thank you.
Thank you. May I call on Anna, followed by PL.
Thank you very much. Like others before me, we welcome the updated document, and we are very pleased to see that the policy includes minimum standards related to disability inclusion, vulnerable individuals and groups, and indigenous peoples. Along with consultation and participation of major groups and local communities, it would be important to support the identification and meaningful inclusion of those individuals and groups that are most at risk of being left behind throughout the actual project development and implementation process, paying particular attention to those individuals facing multiple barriers due to intersecting identity factors, for example, Indigenous women and girls or those with disabilities. And while we very much welcome the references to gender equality in the new policy, we would also like to see them integrated throughout the document and not just in a single section. For example, in references to meaningful consultation and to workers to reflect the intention of the GEF to mainstream gender equality across all aspects of its operations. And finally, in line with many of the previous comments, we support the proposed revisions to the decision that the UK put forward, and we also look forward to regular progress reports from the Secretariat on the policy's implementation. Thank you.
Thank you. May I call on Pierre, followed by Munenari.
Merci, Naoko.
Thank you, Naoko. We also support without reservation the new framework for environmental and social safeguards. We agree that you should have a robust framework, and as there is something that we want to suggest as an addition, and here I support the comment made by my British colleague, which is to strengthen the monitoring framework for our council when it comes to the challenges that the FEM could meet by planning for an overall monitoring more frequent than annually, and as you proposed, and then by having a mechanism, an early warning mechanism in case there should be a problem, so that early on we be informed of the situation. But the way in which Josh presented it seemed perfectly fine to us. Thank you.
Thank you. May I call on Munenari, followed by Mata.
Thank you, Madam Co-Chair. Like previous speakers, I also welcome the updated policy on environmental and social safeguards. At the same time, I'm also happy to have a stronger safeguards on environment and social aspects of the activities of the GEF. And I also think that having strong standards on environment and social issues is quite important for an institution like the GEF, whose mandate is to promote better environment in the world. And so in that perspective, I'm ready to support the revisions proposed by the UK. Thank you.
Thanks much. May I call on Mata, followed by Jane.
Gracias, Presidenta.
Thank you. Our constituency in the Southern Cone, we're happy to see this updated policy, and we accompany the approval of this policy, and we also feel that compliance with this policy should not imply possibly an additional cost. We agree also with other countries the need to have a design for the guidelines for this compliance. And I would like to give the floor to a member of the Argentina delegation that would like to make a comment. Thank you. Thank you, Marta. Thank you, Madam Chair. Only to make a comment. We support, of course, the policy, and it seems like Marta has said, it's very welcome. We have noticed that in the glossary there's a definition on indigenous peoples, and we have observed that this is a matter on which there is no express definition within the realm of the United Nations, and therefore we feel that maybe we should omit such a definition herein. This is a topic, of course, to deal in another forum. So, therefore, we like to make available to the Council this possibility of not including this paragraph. Thank you very much.
Thank you. May I call on Jane, followed by Laura.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Francois, for the presentation.
My constituency welcomes the updated policy, but would like to note that gaps may also exist within countries to manage these new areas being proposed, and where possible, GEF finance projects should also serve as a catalyst in raising awareness and strengthening national capacity to carry out the full responsibilities expected for identifying, addressing, documenting, monitoring, and reporting on the updated ESS standards. Thank you.
Thank you. May I call on Laura?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Our constituency, made up by Ecuador, Brazil, and Colombia, is thankful to the Secretariat for the efforts to update this policy. We all know that these are basic elements to guarantee successful projects. It's significant that we mention, just like others have done, that each one of our countries, we also have significant safeguards that supplement and are the basis for them within the framework of the GEF and the agencies, and they are a warranty that indeed they will be worked on. These social and environmental issues that are so important. We just wanted to mention two items. One, this update should not imply additional costs for countries. I think this also has to do with the fact that at the time they're done, that is, these risk studies vis-a-vis environmental hazards or risk, the studies should be done before implementation, but oftentimes it is while implemented when they are these risks are identified and come to be. So it is very important that we take this into account and know that some things may be foreseen from planning stages, but others, they will only be tabled when the projects begin to be implemented. And finally, we would also like to express our concern about definition of indigenous peoples in the framework of different conventions, and specifically the Biodiversity Convention have had a great dialogue about indigenous populations and local communities, terms on which there is a consensus. Indigenous peoples and local communities without having a specific definition. It's rather subject to national circumstances and the realities of each of our countries. Thank you.
Thank you. Did we hear from everybody, right? Okay, so Francois and the team, could you please respond to questions?
Thank you very much, Naoko. Let me first register and express appreciation for the broad support that is being given to this document. It's been in the making for a long while, and it has been the object of extensive consultation and, as such, of the extensive balancing act that happens across the spectrum of diverse views, right? I noticed that in some of the comments provided, there are points that have not been accommodated before or could not be accommodated before as part of the balancing act. So I think it marks the fact that we have a viable compromise, one that is indeed raising the bar of minimum standards and accommodating the desire of many constituencies to see the gaps that we had identified covered by this policy, and we may not be able to satisfy the totality of some of the requests, but we have a working compromise. So that's a very satisfying first observation. The proposed amendments by the UK have received extensive support, and we think it is workable to bring them on board. The policy is intended to apply to agency regardless of the modalities of implementation. It would, in a sense, apply to private sector if private sector is the way to deliver the project ultimately under the action, the policies, and indeed the accountability of the agency. But it is possible to clarify that in language, and I think it makes sense. It's in no contradiction with the intent, so it can be done. Similarly, having, as part of the decision, a determination to further define the procedure to inform Council in case of non-compliance to satisfy the view expressed here that the periodicity matters, the modalities matters. I think it's a good idea, and it's worth defining, taking the time to define without hindering the adoption. So we would very much be in support of that. The implementation issue, as it was said, is crucial. It always is crucial. We're here for results and not just for policies, obviously. So there is a path to implementation here laid out in the document, and I think I clarified that we would expect to change the templates, which norm the submission of agencies to the Secretariat and shape the review that we can exercise over it. So that's a major step. The guidelines will be produced. Somebody queried the timing of that. We would want to have the guidelines, of course, available before effectiveness of the policy, which is in July. So we would aim at that. But we would also like to have a consultative process over the guidelines to make sure that whatever we come up with has acceptance across the partnership. And so we don't have a date, but we have a commitment to making that process consultative. It is essential to have them for implementation, so we'll have them. Reporting modalities, as we just mentioned, is also part of the implementation issues, and so on pretty much the same time frame, we would make sure that the path to reporting is precisely defined. Another point that was mentioned concerned the opportunity to foster learning as across the partnership that concerns countries, agencies, institutions that may play a role in implementation or execution. And we are certainly committed to that. It is a matter of some complexity, and so we will relay at every opportunity, including the activities that we have in extensive constituency meetings with country, the material that we have developed to make sure that everybody has the same understanding of what it entails to meet those standards. We will, of course, count on the agencies to also relay that. They have the direct accountability for the implementation, but we will make sure that countries have a chance to hear from us what this change entails. I also wanted, that's more a factual question, but one point was raised about whether or not there are provisions against sexual exploitation in the guidelines, and indeed there is such a thing in standard number 1, so that point is in fact covered. Let me give a chance to Roland, whom you all know because he has been instrumental in running the consultations and indeed the drafting for this document, to provide complementary explanations.
Thanks very much, Françoise, and thanks again to everyone for engaging in the process of the past year and for your constructive comments, including today. I think Françoise covered the key comments and questions from your side. Just a couple of additions. There was a question on the reporting on safeguards implementation through midterm reviews and at project completion, which would be effective as of July 2020. The intention here is to ensure a flow-through of information on how agencies are implementing their own safeguard policies, procedures, and systems, including for projects that were approved before the adoption of this policy. So the intention is not to retroactively impose the new minimum standards on projects that are already underway, but simply to ensure that whatever safeguard system is applied, the Council, through the Secretariat, has a way to receive information about how that is implemented in practice. And then, of course, moving forward, more and more of that information will actually be in line with the agency's latest safeguard systems, which hopefully are in line with the minimum standard that we're hoping to set here. With regard to the question on PIF level information, indeed, this was a compromise that we struck based on consultations with agencies. So again, in a framework that relies on agencies, policies, procedures and systems, we thought it's reasonable to base the information requests at the various stages of the project cycle on what the agencies can reasonably provide, in not going significantly above that. So that's why we kept it to indicative information. But again, it doesn't, of course, preclude the possibility that an agency, on a voluntary basis and where the information is available, goes beyond that and thereby gives the Council a little bit more to consider at the time of approval. Finally, on gender and sort of the point around weaving in gender more strongly across the various minimum standards, this has been rather challenging to do, and we've opted to have sort of overarching references to the policy on gender equality, both in the beginning of the policy itself and as we introduce the minimum standards. And, of course, ideally, we would have had an opportunity to consider simultaneously the policies on safeguards, on gender, and on stakeholder engagement, given the heavy interlinkages. But because that wasn't possible, we thought this is a second best. And, of course, if there's a clear need to add references to gender around some of the standards, I mean, let's look at it. But we've really tried to make it clear upfront that as the agencies implement these minimum standards, they would, of course, do so in the context of the provisions of the existing policy on gender equality. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Francois. Thank you, Roland. With that, and we would like to ask the Council to adopt a proposed decision on condition that we include the two suggestions made by UK. One is this to make sure that we cover the implementation chain, then the procedure to inform the Council in case of non-compliance. So with that condition, may I seek your approval? Thank you so much. So let us move on to the next item, which is a updating the GEF's minimum. Updating the GEF's minimum fiduciary standards related to anti-money laundering and combating the financing of terrorism. Again, it's for you, Francois. Floor is yours.
Thank you, Naoko. So the Council, at its 54th meeting in June 2018, requested the Secretariat, in collaboration with the trustee, to present for Council consideration a proposal to update the minimum fiduciary standards to close any immediate gaps related to anti-money laundering and combating the financing of terrorism, which we refer to as AML-CFT. The Council requested that the proposal be in accordance with the principles set out in the June Council paper on the same topic. In response to the Council request, we have presented for the Council consideration this paper on minimum requirements for agencies on AML-CFT, contained in Annex 1 of the document for decision. The requirements underscore the need for agencies to systematically screen individuals and/or entities for risks related to money laundering and the financing of terrorism, and effectively respond to any risks identified, consistent with language included in many agencies' financial procedures agreement with the trustee, the minimum requirements also refer to UN Security Council resolutions. If approved, the proposed requirements would be included in an updated version of the minimum fiduciary standards for GEF partner agencies with immediate effect. To ensure a timely rollout of the minimum requirements, we propose that agencies present either a signed certification of compliance with the minimum requirements or a time-bound action plan to achieve compliance, and this no later than April 30, 2019. We would then compile agency certifications and any action plans for the Council's review and for its decision at the 56th meeting in the spring of 2019. Thank you.
Thank you. I would like to open the floor for comments, questions. Pierre, please.
Merci.
Thank you. I will be brief. I wanted to warmly thank the Secretariat for the work done on this topic. This is the follow-up of the discussion that the Council had in June. It's very satisfactory for us. The updates, the measures that have been proposed go in the right direction, and we fully support them. And I wanted to underline that these updates are all the more welcome that they intervene a few months after the Paris conference on the fight against terrorism financing, during which we asked international financial organizations to strengthen their measures. So the fact that we have an AML-CFT card framework today is extremely welcome. As to the implementation, I took note of the remarks that Françoise just made as to the way the agencies will have to conform to the standards before April 30th, 2019. My question would be about the follow-up. How are we going to make sure that the agencies will fulfill the norms towards the fund? And how are we ourselves going to be able to control this? If you could tell us how, I would welcome this. Thank you. And congratulations again.
Thank you so much. May I call on Marita from Sweden, followed by Konrad from Switzerland.
Thank you, Naoko. We strongly support this proposal, which we expect will contribute to increased harmonization of standards among agencies. And we would just like to ask you if you have information on what type of gaps in minimum standards that you may have identified. I think that would be of interest. Thank you.
Thank you. May I call on Konrad, followed by Carola.
Thank you. We also very much appreciate this updating of the minimum standards and also the plan that's been foreseen to check on or ensure compliance by the agencies. We would very much like to echo what our French colleague has said. What will be the monitoring in the future? Will there be a regular monitoring to ensure that these standards are being complied with?
Thank you so much. May I call on Carola, followed by Mr. Inamov.
Thank you, Naoko, and thank you also for this document, which we appreciate very much. I'd have 2 points to make. One was a suggestion for you. We very much welcome that this focuses on money laundering and financing of terrorism. But we think we should also look at misuse of funds more broadly. And I've understood also from the info documents that this policy deals only with money laundering and financing of terrorism, but that broader matters will be part of a proposed update in the fall of 2019. That would be very welcome, and we would even think, if possible, it would be good to accelerate this to the spring of 2019. So I'd like to hear your confirmation of that this is being worked on and your views on whether it's possible to accelerate this. Now, my second point is what we decide here today actually is hidden in Annex 1 of the document where we list up the minimum requirements for agencies. And there the second point says that agencies notify the Council in a timely manner through the Secretariat. The question is, of course, what is timely? Because we've had some instances within our development cooperation where it was essential for ministers to be informed at the beginning when a suspicion arises. And we've experienced that in the case of the GEF, we were informed only after an executing agency had investigated a certain case. And we don't think that that's good to be informed only at the end of a trajectory because, well, we want to be able to act upon issues and not to hear about them towards the end. So we would actually want to propose that in this annex where it says agencies notify in a timely manner the Council, we write agencies notify the Council immediately when, etc. And of course this will be confidential. It is already, but it's even more so important when it's about a suspicion that's not yet investigated. But we think it's important that we are informed immediately. And that in a timely manner is too vague to make sure that this is the case.
Thank you. May I call on Mr. Inamov, followed by Ruel of Grenada.
Thank you very much. Also, I will be very brief. We support the updating of these minimum fiduciary standards, and I think that we need to continue the work on this regard because we need to be clear that all the financial resources are clean of misuse, both for the anti-money laundering and also combating or financing the terrorism. But of course, at the same time, we need to be sure that the agencies reporting to the Council is also on timely manner, not making the extended time limit for the investigation of such cases if they appear. Thank you.
Thank you so much. May I call on Ruel, followed by Lauren.
Thank you very much, Chair. We from the Caribbean constituency lend our support to this paper and this initiative from the vantage point that the region is currently suffering the challenge of de-risking and the impact that the loss of correspondent banking have on various sectors of our economy, including our ability to mobilize resource, for example, through instruments such as the GEF. Our main concern, however, resides with the ability to enforce the reporting mechanism because when we went through the document, we noted that the agencies in large respects are expected to self-report, to provide information voluntarily, well, not voluntarily, but they are the ones who are going to be taking the lead to provide the information. Considering earlier this morning we had a very long discourse on the low level of reporting at the midterm and at the terminal level from those agencies, what will be the compliance mechanism in place? What will be the enforcement mechanism to ensure that we get those information coming in from those agencies? Because from we in the region, we want to ensure that we can continue to have access to the international financial system, and any step in that direction of demonstrating that all our partners and associations, etc., have in place a very strong anti-money laundering and financing of terrorism procedures in place helps in the argument that we are operating above board. So we remain concerned about how we're going to enforce those reporting mechanisms.
Thank you so much. May I call on Lauren, followed by Peter.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you very much for these revised minimum fiduciary standards. We are very pleased with these standards, but we would like to echo the comment made by my colleague from the Netherlands on the issue of immediate reporting to the Council if any issue arises or is discovered. We would also encourage a revision as soon as possible on the issue of misuse of funds or corruption, as my colleague also mentioned. And then we just have 2 clarification comments or questions. We would like to know what is meant by with standard decision-making procedures. Is this defined by each agency or is it defined at the level of the GEF? And in terms of screening of recipients of GEF funding by agencies, what does this entail? Is there any common guidance that will be provided by the GEF on how to conduct such screenings? Thank you very much.
Thank you. May I call on Peter, followed by Sayed?
Thank you, Naoko. Courtesy of previous speakers, I can be very quick. Welcome the proposal for this updated policy, an important issue, critical issue, as we've discussed. In the order they appear in the annex, I think, first of all, Lauren's point is something that we believe that there will be need for specific, clear instruction or guidance, and whether that comes through this document or implementation guidelines, the need to be consistently giving advice, or rather giving consistent advice to agencies as to what they should screen against will be critical. You know, should it, for instance, be consolidated United Nations Security Council's list in the sanction space, for instance, but it needs to be specified so agencies know what standards we're expecting them to screen against. And similarly, the second point, Corolla's first mentioned, is the question of notifying Council, while absolutely adhering to the principle of innocent until proven guilty. Any suspicion or speculation in the public domain of a misuse of funds along these lines can have a devastating impact on the GEF's donor base, a devastating impact on the reputational interests of the GEF and the implementing partners. So a timely manner is insufficient from a reputational risk point of view, and with the appropriate confidentiality guidelines, I think immediately informed Council has to be a minimum standard. Thank you.
Thank you so much. May I call on Sayed, followed by UK Jos.
Thank you, Madam Chair. We welcome the initiative. Just a small clarification on the sub-para 1C at the very end and related resolution. Somehow my delegation would like to propose either whether we delete this phrase or put it some more clarity on it by adding and delete that phrase and say and other relevant resolution on terrorism and money laundering, just for the sake of more clarity. Thank you.
Thank you. May I call on Jos, followed by Matthew?
Yes, thank you. The same remarks I made last time apply here also. Clarification about the supply chain. And then I wonder if the remarks that have been made by colleagues about notice of reputational risk might usefully be bundled up with the provision that we've agreed for the previous paper as well, which is that the Secretariat gives it some thought and then gives us an idea of how that should be handled, notification and how that would be best. So I'll leave that with you in the Council. And then Pierre-Olivier's point reminds me that we have, in respect of our accreditation review for agencies, that they annually attest that they're in compliance with the accreditation requirements. How will these provisions be connected to that? Because I imagine as we tighten the screw on all of these provisions, they should apply in some holistic way to the annual attestation of compliance by the agencies, and then, of course, periodic spot checks by the Secretariat if they think that's necessary. So if you could just remind me of that connection, I'd be grateful. Thank you.
Thank you. May I call on Matthew, followed by Jorge.
No, thank you very much, and we'd like to thank the Secretariat for your work on this, and in particular for the extensive coordinating work you did to get to this point. I'll just note that we strongly support the proposal that you've put on the table. We think it's an extremely important update to the standards for the GEF, and I'll just lend my voice to those who have talked about the importance of immediate reporting to the Council when issues arise. As others, I think it's important that we're informed of that quickly. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. May I invite Jorge, followed by Ana.
Gracias, Presidenta.
Thank you, Madam Chair. We support the updating of the minimum fiduciary standards, but just like the others who have spoken before us, we believe that any relevant information ought to be notified on a timely basis to Council, and therefore we support the amendment proposed by the Netherlands. Thank you.
Thank you. May I call on Anal, followed by Munenali.
Thank you very much. We welcome this document, including the proposed updates to the existing minimum fiduciary standards. And in particular, we wanted to highlight the principle of proactive disclosure on the part of the agencies. Just very briefly, as highlighted by a number of other members, we wanted to support what the Netherlands has put forward, and also to note the importance of understanding how the Secretariat plans to address the potential misuse of funds beyond what is covered in this policy. And so we echo the point made by the Netherlands on whether any updates on such a policy could be accelerated and brought to the Council at the 56th meeting in June, as well as ask for immediate notification of any potential risks. Thank you.
Thank you so much. May I call on Muninari?
Thank you, Madam Co-Chair. Like many previous speakers, I also support the updated minimum fiduciary standards on the anti-money laundering and combating the financing of terrorism. And actually, up until July this year, I was working on FATF issues and financial sanctions against North Korea. And I fully understand the importance of having a strong standards in this field for an institution like GEF, who is acting as international financial mechanism to have a strong standards in this area. And I'd like to ask the Secretariat to regularly check the strength of the standards going forward to ensure that the GEF standards conforms with the internationally accepted practice. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for your support. I would like to ask Francois and Roland to respond to some of the questions tabled. Are you ready, or
sure.
You need time?
Thank you very much, Naoko. Well, again, let me welcome the broad expression of support for this change. It had to move ahead fairly quickly as a stopgap measure of sorts because of urgency. And I think it is a very good thing for the partnership that in a spirit of compromise, we, through these consultations, were able to reach that point fairly quickly. So thank you for that, and we're looking forward for the possibility of making the change as soon as possible in the rule book of the GEF. At the same time, as you all know, there is an ongoing review of fiduciary minimum standards, which is operating in parallel, which is still early in the process, on which we have submitted an information document, which is only a progress report, and on which we expect, as the further evaluation of gaps in potential gaps across the partnership will help us do for fiduciary what we have just done today for safeguards, which is to define the minimum requirements of our fiduciary policy across the partnership, it will be, again, minimum requirements, meaning that the agencies have their own policies in place, and there will be a need to assess compliance of the agencies with the minimum requirements. Yeah? So that's operating in parallel, which actually means that we will have, over the next year, a chance to revisit in greater length the issue of fiduciary needs for the partnership. But this measure is proposed on a different calendar in order to make sure the gap is filled as soon as possible. So the gaps are under analysis, and one of the things that we will do in the context of this policy, once we have reached and put in place the minimum requirement for the fiduciary standards, we will have a third-party review of compliance, which will take place along the path and will include the current dimensions, with the idea of facilitating the process of assessing compliance with an independent view, right? So that's on our path as well. On the issue of who's accountable that some have raised in the context of this AML-CFT policy, the agencies are accountable. The agencies, the implementation of this policy is under the responsibility of the agencies. The same logic as previously discussed applies, meaning that they are responsible throughout the implementation chain and regardless of the implementation arrangement, and they have an obligation in line with their own commitment to this policy in their own words to actually watch over that this is put in place, which doesn't mean that we cannot bring in the wording in a parallel move to the one we've just had, right? So I understand that you've made that proposal, and that's something that we're open-minded to considering. When it comes to reporting and enforcement, indeed, the modalities are not spelled out in this document, and we need to bring this to attention. So we will be working, and I think it's the parallel suggestion that the UK has made. We could have the same opportunity to report back on how process, procedure, format, periodicity, which has been raised by a number of comments, and also the timing of reporting, which is a much more difficult question. The timing of reporting, in other words, is reporting happening on ongoing investigation initiated by agencies, which is not necessarily something that is helpful to their process of discovery. And there's a trade-off here between confidentiality and investigation and early reporting. So I think it is at least worthy of a solid conversation and not one that is necessarily easy to jump to conclusion on. So that's a very important question. Or are they reporting on concluded investigations once the facts are established and once they can come back to us and share with us both what has led them into the need for this investigation, what they have learned from it, and how they have established the facts. So in response to the comments received, what I propose we do on this is to proceed by essentially leaving in line with the UK suggestion the issue of how we define further the whole implementation dimension to a further contribution by us. But with a word of caution on this issue of reporting on ongoing investigations, which we know as a fact agencies have rules about and may not be in a situation to give satisfaction to some of the requests of counsel. And that, of course, has to be considered from a legal standpoint first. It has to be discussed with agencies at length because they cannot commit to something that would not be permissible under their rules and commitments, right? So we would look into this further. Let me stop here and give Roland a chance to respond to some of the other questions. Roland, please.
I think the main question that was left was this periodic monitoring and reporting on agencies' compliance with the policy on minimum fiduciary standards, and the same applies to other policies such as safeguards, gender and stakeholder engagement. The policy that the Council adopted 2 years ago is still in force, and that set out a process whereby the agencies would essentially self-assess their compliance with relevant GEF policies. They would alert us to any changes in the policies or frameworks on the basis of which they were accredited or initially found compliant with GEF standards. And there would be a risk-based third-party review that would go deeper as needed, particularly where changes were significant or an agency's implementation experience warrants. That's in place. That would essentially kick in at the end of GEF 7. Now, of course, the underlying policies are changing, and there will be assessments of all agencies for compliance with those new policies as standards have been adopted and are being adopted. And I think we need to wait for the complete review of the minimum fiduciary standards and any updates to that policy before we decide on when we need this periodic monitoring and reporting to be implemented. But indeed, if as a result of the process next year we decide that a broader update to the fiduciary standards is indeed needed, the next step from that would be looking at all the agencies against all the standards, including on AML-CFT.
Carola.
Thanks, Naoko, and thanks to all of you for the replies. I do understand and acknowledge that implementing agencies have their own set of rules. At the same time, if we agree with them on a project, I think we also have a right to ask for some implementing arrangements, including an arrangement about what to do exactly when misuse of funds in whatever way is possibly the case. So, okay, I can understand you cannot immediately here say now, okay, we agree here that this is done immediately because you need to talk to the implementing agencies. But then I would like to agree here today and want you to explicitly confirm that you will do in the coming process the utmost to agree with everyone that they inform you and through you us immediately when there is a suspicion of misuse of funds in whatever way. I'd really want us to agree that today. I think that's this commitment from your side to do the utmost is, I think, doable to agree here today.
Okay.
Aparna, please come in.
Thank you, Naoko. I just went up to... I just have one suggestion. I don't know whether you would like to consider it right now or when you do the review. In the Annex 1, where we have defined the minimum requirements for agencies on AML and CFT, our capitals have suggested, possibly because of having uniformity of language, that in para 1A, systematically screen individuals and or entities to whom GEF funds are transferred. That is how it reads. So there is a suggestion to add the words after entities and or their beneficial owners. So you can have a look whether this will bring us in conformity with the standard language used for AML and CFT. So in addition to systematically screening individuals and entities, after that we add and or their beneficial owners. So this is the suggestion from our principal. That is one. And after screen, to consider adding after the verb screen, to consider adding, including carrying out customer due diligence. Including carrying out customer due diligence. What I just suggest is that, this is our suggestion. You could look at what is the normal or the accepted language used in similar requirements and then have a look at it.
Well, to be very frank, there might be a trade-off here between immediate adoption of a stopgap measure pending further due diligence and modification of the wording, because that has been the object of a very close legal discussion across members of the partnership, and we are not able on short notice to make a change to that. So that's a first consideration, right? I understand that the Council has interest for a broader conversation on the issue of what gets triggered on implementation, compliance, and reporting, and that can be certainly taken on board by the Council with the view of coming back with further specific suggestions in short order. But I think there's a process dimension here that we have to mention. I would also like to bring to the attention that the Annex 1 has a second paragraph that might have been overlooked here, although some people quoted it, right, which it has a broader intent than the AML CFT policy. This paragraph is filling a gap which in language in the existing policy, which does not contain any provision for agency notification of Council through the Secretariat of issues that they have encountered. Now, as pointed out, you would probably want more precision than a timely manner in this wording, and I understand that. But the intent here is to make sure that at least we clarify with agencies that there is an expectation that when concern is identified and once sufficient information is available, they have to come and inform the Council about the issue. So we see the benefit of adoption of that paragraph, again in a stopgap type of approach, as putting on paper that requirement, and from which we will need the further definition of the modalities by which it would be serviced, which I think we could come to you with on our next meeting. So the intent would be there, the commitment would be there. I think we have to do justice to the technicity of the legal due diligence required here to make sure that we don't adopt something that is not implementable, right? Thank you.
Thank you. Decision. Thank you so much for the very constructive discussion. May I call your your approval for the proposed decision? All right. Do you have any comments? Say it.
Thank you. I would like to know whether my proposal also included or not.
Yes. Yes. This concerns the last sentence of paragraph C, if I got right your initial comment, and you were suggesting a different formulation that would mention other relevant resolution on terrorism rather than the one we currently have. In the context of the type of due diligence that has been applied from a legal standpoint to this document, leading to that formulation and to agreement around the formulation, this is language which is already available in the respective policies of a number of our agencies, which is why it has had the support of that formulation. So again, I'm not in a situation to modify that at this point.
Say it.
Thank you, Madam. I would like to propose to defer the final decision on this. I shall consult with Bank Capital.
Peter?
Thank you, Noko, and thank you, Françoise. I may have missed it in your response, but recognise what you had said most recently about the importance of the paragraph 2 in the annex, which gets us into a broader area of misuse of funds, which I'm very comfortable with. But I just wanted to come back to one of the points I made in my first intervention, was the guidance around this screening. What will be the assessment against what? Now, I know you've consulted broadly, including with, I assume, the trustee, which is referenced in the paper. So it may be that you have a very clear idea of what that model of screening looks like, but I just welcome a little more detail on that. With that, I'm quite comfortable to go ahead and support the approval of this. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. In the way the policy is set up, each agency would use its own procedures to conduct the screening of individuals and entities. The agencies have processes in place already to do that, because we had very positive feedback on the existence of these procedures. So we are not trying to norm it, but we are trying to clarify the accountability here, and that certainly would not stop the conversation in terms of sharing the experience that is going on around the partnership on the ways of doing that, perhaps for the benefits of some of the agencies which are seeking improvement. So that's where we are on this for the time being.
Jos?
Yeah, thanks. 1C. If this is, as you said, Françoise, standard language or existing language with respect to UN Security Council,
GEF portfolio was found to include fairly large numbers of projects that had been operationally completed but not financially closed according to the trustees' records, and thereby increasing the value of those agencies' active portfolios. In that context, the Council requested the Secretariat, in collaboration with all agencies, to present to the 55th Council complete and up-to-date information on the GEF's share of each agency's portfolio and a suggested way forward regarding the 30% ceiling decided during the replenishment. The GEF Secretariat, together with agencies, has therefore undertaken an exercise to calculate the ratio of the GEF's share of every agency's portfolio as of October 15, 2018. It's worth mentioning that although the GEF in its information system has, of course, extensive knowledge of the GEF portfolio of agency, the GEF in its system does not have information about the activities of the agencies across the range of projects and programs that they run outside the GEF context. So relative to the previous analysis, once this calculation was run, the data presented in this paper reflects both an adjusted methodology applied uniformly across agencies' active portfolios. We had lots of back and forth with agencies for quite a while to make sure that all were adopting similar definitions, as well as agencies' concerted efforts to close outstanding projects that had been operationally completed but not financially closed. A strong management effort went into that initiative with some noticeable results. At this point, the data suggests that while two agencies have shares just below 30%, the GEF does not currently account for more than 30% of the total active portfolio of any of the agencies. The Secretariat recommends the following implementation modalities for the application of the 30% ceiling. Firstly, agencies will report to the Secretariat the volume of their non-GEF portfolios on an annual basis, beginning on June 30, 2020. Secondly, the Secretariat will report annually to the Council on the GEF's share of agencies' portfolio, starting in the fall of 2020. The Council will review such reports and will decide on any measures to be taken should an agency by then exceed the 30% ceiling. The Secretariat will continue to work with agencies and will work in particular to define templates and guidance to facilitate clear and consistent reporting by agencies on their non-GEF portfolios. The Secretariat will also conduct a retroactive analysis of the application of the 30% ceiling at the end of GEF 7 and report on the experience and lessons learned at the 61st Council meeting in the fall of 2021. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Francois, for this detailed presentation. The floor is open for comments from Council members. Thank you. Abdul, yeah, you can proceed. Yes, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I have a few points on the 30% of the GEF. The 30% policy of the GEF does not serve the purpose of level playing field among GEF agencies. It gives advantage to large non-specialized agencies such as UNDP, FAO, and World Bank, and other multilateral development bankers. The calculation of the size of the agency overall resource give advantage for these agencies because GEF portion of their program will appear always small compared to their large program, including non-environment project, specialist agencies such as UN Environment and maybe UNIDO, which has mandate on environment only, and the small program size will appear that the GEF portion. Consisted large portion GEF supported project in UN Environment already reaching the 30%. This is, I think, in the table. This policy is already putting UN Environment out of the business for the current GEF civil. And this is against the development countries. This is not anymore level playing field, but rather giving competitive advantage of large agencies. To be fair to all agencies, the calculation of the 30% cap should only be restricted to the environment portfolio of the agencies, not all projects which include economic and social projects. West Asian country, Lebanon, Jordan, Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, and Yemen, all these countries that will be affected by this policy. It will restrict the choice of the implementing agency and will force the countries. Against it will be to choose other large agencies. The policy of in all these countries is to diversify this, the GEF agencies, to give more role to specialized agencies such as UN Environment. My consistency request the Council to clarify the objectives of the proposed cap and to request additional work from the Secretariat on the metric to be applied in order to ensure the metric reaches these objectives without unintended consequences of eliminating altogether small agencies such as UNEP. Such as UNEP, yeah. Thank you.
Thank you so much. May I call on Jos from UK, followed by Apana.
Yes, thank you very much. Francois, to your team, you're having quite a marathon session today. Indeed you are. Thanks for this timely presentation of a measure to comply with the GEF 7 policy recommendation. We welcome that. But we think that the intent of the policy recommendation is different to that expressed here in this paper. It may not have been clear in the first place, I grant you. And so I want to try and clarify that intention and to suggest a change to the decision accordingly. On intention, I think our interest in this board is to manage GEF agency concentration risk. That is, to manage our exposure to and dependence on an agency. I think it's not our business to manage the funding source risk for other agencies. That's for their boards to do on their behalf, not for us to do on their behalf. So accordingly, I think that the measure that the GEF 7 policy recommendation implied cap for 30% should apply to GEF resources allocated to a particular agency. But I think this ought to be expressed as a target and as a monitoring tool rather than as a hard and fast rule, lest it get in the way of some flexibility which might be necessary down the road. I've recast the decision accordingly and could send that to you by email in the usual way if that would be helpful.
May I call on Apana, followed by Stefan.
I can say that Jocelyn of UK has put it very elegantly. This is also our concern, that we are more concerned about ensuring that GEF funding does not get concentrated with a few agencies. So what has been suggested by UK appears to be quite reasonable to us. We would like to add that, again, highlighting the concept of country ownership and the freedom of choice to remain with countries to select the agencies with whom they would like to work to achieve their not only their NCD but also the global environmental benefits. That should also be a factor that we should take into consideration. Third item, which may be useful for us to arrive at a decision, is that with the high variation in the portfolio size of our agencies and the diversity in the areas in which they are active. For example, if I am allowed to mention the name of agencies, some like WWF may be focusing only on biodiversity. Some may be working only on environment. A few may be working on infrastructure, social sector, environment, climate change, many. So whether the entire portfolio of those agencies will be the right denominator, we should think about it. And finally, the delay in financial closure of the projects also contributes to some kind of a I won't call it a miscalculation, but it colors the data that we have. So how we would like to take that into account. And lastly, this is something I left out in the earlier paper, we have talked again about the introduction of a 12-month time standard for the financial closure of projects that have undergone a terminal evaluation. Then we talk about agencies will report to the Secretariat the volume of their non-GEF portfolios on an annual basis. Realistically, we are finding it difficult to get reporting on GEF projects, right? So to expect the agencies to report on their non-GEF portfolio may be like a difficult stretch. So I would like to align myself with what has been suggested by UK with these additional issues that may help us to come to a decision. Thank you.
May I call on Stefan, followed by Matthew? Sorry.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Can be brief. I would like to align our position to the one of as expressed by the UK and by India for the reasons that were mentioned. I know maybe we were not clear enough when we asked for a decision on that. At least my understanding was a different one than what I got now on the table. It was more about leveling the playing field. And in that respect, what counts more is, of course, the cap of GEF resources. And the point made by Aparna is very important to us as well, that countries should have the opportunity to choose. And that's particularly true in regions that do not have a very broad range of agencies available. Imagine if you have a chemicals project in a region that only has 4 or 5 agencies active. They already topped up on their 30%. That would probably not be what we intended to have through such a new policy. So we believe it needs to be rethought. As it stands right now, we could not support the decision. Thank you.
May I call on Matthew, followed by Lauren?
Thank you very much, and thank you for your work on this issue. We think it's an important issue to address, for the purpose, as Stefan just mentioned, of leveling the playing field. But we would also support the UK's suggestion to recast it as a percentage of GEF resources and more as a target rather than a hard requirement, that seems to get more to the intention of the original request. So thank you very much.
Thank you. May I call on Lauren, followed by PL.
Thank you, Chair. As our constituency can't accept the suggestion as made here, and we had already mentioned at the meeting in Da Nang in June that we suggested for the Secretariat that we look at this issue the other way around, that we look at the total budget of the GEF and maybe put a maximum or a target or a ceiling or something for total budget of the GEF that a single agency can access. So we support the suggestion made by the UK, but I think we would like, in order to make a decision on this, we would like to get some more data on possible consequences before we can make a final decision, so that we don't have any unintended consequences that would occur. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. May I call on PL, followed by Belgium Jos.
Thank you. A few items on our side. First of all, I would like to seize the opportunity to tell you that the instrument of contribution to GEF 7 was signed by France and transmitted to the World Bank, which means that formalizes our contribution of $300 million to the fund. It is an important commitment for us, and that's why we would like to have the implementation rule for GEF 7 be clarified as soon as possible, so that the work program of GEF be as coherent as possible with the financial orientation that we have decided on. As to the ceiling, what we think, and we still think, it's not something new because we already talked about here, there is no good governance that an institution be too dependent on the resources from GEF. So we support the work to be pursued in this. We do note all the data that we were given today. I should confess that we still have issues to understand the methodology for computation that you have settled on, and we would like to decide on the issue. In transparency, we would like to have your methodology as was followed by you, so that we might reconcile all the computations that we heard of. Now, secondly, on the computation issue, we have a question, and this is what follows. What is the perimeter that we will keep to calculate the ceiling for an agency? For some agencies, depending on their portfolio, that might have different consequences, and in order to have a plain level field, we would like for all agencies to have a perimeter, only the portfolio of their activities for which a funding of GEF is possible. Otherwise, the rule that we would decide on would be favorable for agencies that are centered, that work on the environment. Third item, as to the schedule, what you suggested is that the reporting rules, the new ones, be implemented in 2020. We think, why so far in time? Because we understand that the reporting modalities are already feasible, and the agencies could already give us this type of information, and there we would like to have your comments. Fourthly, I think that it would be significant to think again and still on the consequences that we will have if there were no no respect for the ceilings that we would decide on. It's an open question. We should work on it as fast as possible, as quickly as possible. And then last point, on another item, but still on the ceiling, I would like to note that France would like to work in the next council on harmonizing of the fees that are applied to all the agencies that are still not harmonized. It would be a very significant topic for us. To conclude, I don't know if it's for the same reason, and I think that the other chairs have expressed. We haven't finished this exercise. We are not done with it, and we have not gotten to a point where we have all the items to make a decision that would be a good decision. Thank you.
Thank you, Pierre. May I call on Marita? May I call on Marita and sorry, I confused myself. May I call on Jos Belgium? Jos, you are on.
You may. I thought I fell off the list, but I'm getting confused here. But I mean, the reading of the decision or the request we asked, I think, was the limiting to the 30%. We don't want any organization to be over-dependent from the GEF for its existence. I thought that was the whole idea. A level playing field, to me, is a completely other story. And balancing the shares of agencies, I believe, is a completely other exercise, and a much more difficult one, because we hear the countries have a choice of agencies. So if the numbers show it, the countries choose basically 4 or 5 agencies for whatever reason. Now, if you want to keep that freedom of choice, how are you going to level the playing field? How are you going to make those shares come more evenly distributed? I don't know, but that's another exercise. I was sort of amusingly pleased with the fact that changing your methodology all of a sudden took away the problem. Yeah? So you calculate another way and there's no more 30%. You cut off here a bit of here and a bit there, and then what's left is fine. I take the point that real financial closure, is that not important? Well, we had a discussion this morning. It is important, right? And so I'm also not sure that both sides of the equation are actually the same. Maybe, yes, you say the same level of CEO endorsement in the non-GEF projects, no financial closure, but has the nature of the project been taken into account? Are they comparable? We've heard a couple of comments already on this matter, so I won't extend on that. But I'm not sure that the equation and that the numbers are actually completely trustworthy. So I join my colleague from France that we haven't come to the end of the exercise probably. But otherwise, I think that what you suggest in following up the shares and also the reporting from the agencies is the right way to go. Maybe it's a bit difficult for the agencies, but they still have time until 2020 to adapt and to get their act together to sort of harmonize that also, so that we don't have completely, so that we have comparable information. Thanks.
Thank you, Jos. May I call on Peter from Australia, followed by Marita from Sweden.
Thank you, Naoko, and thank you also to Françoise and the Secretary again for taking forward what I think was an imprecise mandate, and I'm being generous in the use of that word, which I recall came towards the end of the replenishment policy recommendations discussion, at a point when, you know, we could see the end in sight, and we'd made some very great progress, and there was a lot of money dangling in the middle of the room that we wanted to capture. So I think an apology on behalf of the replenishment group, perhaps, for maybe a lack of precision or timeliness of thought about what we asked would be in order, because, you know, you've done the job. You have responded to returning with a proposal for the application of a ceiling. Having looked at that proposal, I think many of us have thought, actually, we've got this a bit wrong. We've come at it perhaps in the wrong end of the telescope. I think the three things that strike me as being out of whack here really, unfortunately, are the intent, the metric, and the methodology. And on that basis, I think, as others have said, we could not agree to this decision as drafted going forward. I think we do have a job to do, and I think Joss stated that quite clearly. You know, our role as a council here is the oversight and the governance and the direction of GEF resources. And it's the GEF's resources that should come first and foremost. We are not, by extension, a governing body for the agencies in the implementing partnership. And I think the way that perhaps this was expressed through the earlier process focused the GEF Council's responsibility in the wrong place. We shouldn't be thinking about a metric that would deal with dependence. We should think about a metric that would ensure the maximum benefit of the GEF's resources, and for that reason, the concentration risk is perhaps a better prism for us to view a ceiling through. As drafted and viewed through the prism of a dependency metric, this will do nothing at all to help deliver strong, competitive project proposals across the partnership to the benefit of countries. And the unintended consequences of our perhaps rushed conclusion of this discussion in the replenishment process would potentially directly impact countries that my constituency cares about deeply, and that's our near neighbours in the Pacific, where, as has been referenced by a couple of council members, there is lesser choice. There are fewer agencies that operate, and the ones that do are more likely to be the specialised agencies rather than the larger MDBs in our partnership who cover the waterfront of issues. So I think a crude application of an ill-thought-through metric that we've imposed upon you, and again, congratulations for trying to interpret what we thought we were asking for, but I think the unintended consequences are clear to us now. So absolutely support the proposal that Joss put forward earlier in the discussion, and look forward to coming back to this. I think in the meantime, support for the Secretariat's pursuit of statistics and data from the partnership, the annual reporting by agencies, the annual reporting by the Secretariat is all solid and of value. But I think we need to rethink through the concentration risk prism, be clearer on our intent, and come back with a revised policy that will actually deliver something of benefit to the GEF rather than impose unintended consequences on our implementing partners and our recipient countries. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. May I call on Marita from Sweden, followed by Yannick.
Thank you, Chair. I think it's clear by now that this proposal is not going to resolve the problem that we wanted to address. When we started discussing this at the first replenishment meeting, I remember it. I mean, we were focusing on concentration risk. Those of us who brought it up, it was on concentration risk, and then the discussion eventually evolved, and I think it's also our fault towards the end. We should have been a bit clearer in the replenishment, but we also need to avoid over-dependency. So we need both of these sides of the coin. So I don't have a good suggestion on how to go forward, but I suggest the suggestion made, at least on the concentration risk, made by the UK. How we will address the other issue, I'm not sure. Thank you.
Thank you. May I ask, call on Yannick, followed by Cordula.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The constituency of Central Africa has looked at this document for all the agencies. We understand the goal that the agency should not be dependent on the GEF beyond 30%. But it's difficult to take a position on these 30%. But there is a point that we want to make in Central Africa. It seems that we could be close to this. The UNDP has 29.3%. It's been selected to coordinate the Congo Basin program, and we hope that the program will be able to be integrated in the next work program of the Council if it has the necessary requirements for the GEF 7. If we are unable to present our program because of this new criteria, then what alternative could be suggested so that we won't have a problem? Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. May I call on Kojura, followed by Tunisia.
Well, I agree with those who said that we have given you an unprecise mandate in the GEF 7 replenishment discussions, and I think I felt that our target was to maximize the benefits of the diversity of the GEF partnership by allowing all agencies to participate in a significant way in the partnership. And what we are doing now is a different exercise, which may also be valuable because there is a good sense in preventing over-dependency of agencies on GEF funding. But in this sense, I would rather support Joss and Apana with what they said in the beginning. We should try to reduce risks which come to the GEF if we depend on single agencies for the majority of the programs. And we should maybe rather use targets than we should use caps. But we should also hurry up because GEF 7 resources are already being allocated. And if we do not act now, we might end up having a scenario which is exactly the one that we wanted to prevent when we were discussing the issue in the GEF 7.
Thank you so much. May I call on Sabrina, followed by Aliyu Chuya, Mongolia.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I will express myself in French.
The North African constituency, which I represent, has concerns when it comes to this proposal. We'd like to know, first of all, more details when it comes to the basis and the vision for this proposal. Is it that you want to avoid that an agency would depend too much on the GEF funding, or do you want to try to help the newly accredited agencies to have access to the GEF? I don't think in any case that these problems will be solved by this proposal. And this measure would have impact on the possibility for the countries to choose the best implementing agency for its projects. There would be consequences on a country when the cap of 30% will be reached. So what will happen if we have started preparing a project with an agency? I think that this needs to be studied more in detail to see the possible effects on the countries. Thank you.
Thank you, Sabrina. May I call on
Well, Madam Chair, I would just give, to make your life easier, just
If it's okay, you can call me Ari. That's a nickname.
Thank you for helping.
I have a very long, complicated name, so I usually do that. I think most of the countries, and particularly the recipient developing countries, expressed, and our constituency would complement what they have said earlier. And if you see the figure, I'm not. First of all, I'm not speaking in favor of UNEP or UNIDO, but for example, UNEP is there. For example, now we have a Minamata Convention, and it's a Minamata Convention Secretariat itself, and chemicals. It's with the UNEP, and UN biodiversity is part of kind of UNEP, and So if you see the conventions and implementation and the role of their expertise and involvement and long-term trustful cooperation established, all that things, I think it would be another question of having sailed. And so briefly, our constituency is not really going to support this decision. Thank you.
Thank you, Ari. May I call on Paul, followed by Munenari.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Our constituency wants to welcome this proposal, but we have concerns beyond the concerns that have already been mentioned by my colleagues a while ago, at a time when most countries of my constituency have established their national portfolio for GEF after having a national dialogue, and the agencies have been identified. Resources have been committed by the government and by the agencies. So it would be unfair if after all this work, the projects of a given country could not go forward because of the 30% cap. In addition, the implementation of this cap will depend on the possibility for other agencies will be able to give us adequate services in view of the increased demand. So perhaps there can be additional measures to accompany this policy. Perhaps you could give the agencies a grace period and allowing them to restructure themselves, and perhaps this 30% cap could be implemented later on. Perhaps this goes contrary to what France has said, but we feel that this would be a good measure. Thank you.
Thank you. May I call on Munenari, followed by Laura.
Thank you, Madam Co-Chair. On the application of the 30% cap, I'm pretty much on the same page as UK colleagues, German colleagues, and many other previous speakers. And for all the reasons already explained, I also see merits in setting a cap on the allocation for individual agency within the total GEF budget. And also, I'd like to say that, like Peter, as one of the participants to the GEF 7 replenishment process, my apologies to the Secretariat. I believe that we should have been more precise on the intention of our guidance, so I have no intention of blaming the Secretariat on this issue. And so I'd like to support the proposal proposed by our UK colleagues. Thank you.
Thank you. May I call on Laura, followed by Shaibor.
Gracias, señora Presidenta. Thank you, Madam Chair. Our constituency joins the interventions of most that have spoken before. We agree with what UK, India, Australia, and others have proposed. 3 basic points, and we don't want to extend. First, the need to preserve in the decision of a country which agency they will work with. It's been for years that we have worked with the strengths of each one of the agencies, and let's say we've had history with some of them, and we know how we can be better partners for some topics. So that must be a decision that must remain in the hands of each one of the receiver countries. Second, we do agree with the subject of studies and others. If the intent, as some of the countries that have been involved in this process has been different, then we must adjust this analysis or review done by the Secretariat with good intentions. And lastly, we'd like to highlight the fact that this type of measures and some others cannot have an impact that will prevent countries to carry out their projects in the best manner. So thank you, but we could not accept it the way it is proposed. Thank you.
May I call on Shaibo, followed by Paola?
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My constituency would like to have more precision when it comes to the motives for this measure, because we want to be sure, first of all, that this measure will be discussed among the countries, because it should not have an impact on the sovereignty of the countries. They have to choose which agencies they want to work with. But at the same time, I think we should stress more strengthening the comparative advantages of the agencies. In other words, GEF resources should be resources that serve as to catalyze efforts on the national level. That's very important. So you have to look at the comparative advantages of these agencies. These should be reinforced, and the agencies should be encouraged to support the countries to carry out their development actions and to produce other advantages. So we need more details when it comes to your motives, and we need to document all of this so that we in the countries can really look at these measures when it comes to our programs with the different agency, because the GEF projects are included in the country program that we have. And then you have to look at the agencies. Some agencies are multilateral, they're bigger agencies, and others are regional agencies. And so this should not have an impact. Sometimes we want to have regional programmatic approaches, and so this might become an obstacle for that dynamic. Thank you.
Thank you, Shaibo. May I call on Paola, followed by Marta?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have to say Peter was perfectly right in observing that the donor's mandate was a bit confusing. And I was myself a victim of that confusion, maybe because I joined the Council only recently. So when I read the document, I thought, well, yeah, this is an issue, concentration of, over-reliance of some agencies on GF funds is an issue, and I keep believing it is an issue. But I also realize it's not really us who should be addressing that issue. And looking at the portfolio performance report, among other things, it jumps out quite clearly that there is a concentration of the portfolio in some agencies, and it looks like we are collectively, unable to use the whole range of agencies and capacity. So I very much agree with my neighbor who said that we should work on the comparative advantage of agencies, and we should work with countries. We should understand why countries tend to sort of rely on certain agencies more than others. And in any case, we should address this risk of concentration of the portfolio, and we should seek for balance in the portfolio also in that respect, and that is our task, in fact. And so I would, as others, ask the Secretariat to work on it. And I very much agree with Cordula also that we don't have much time, and it's important to do it timely, because GF7 is underway, and we want to ensure that on the whole, we will end up with a balanced composition of our portfolio also from that point of view. Thank you.
Thank you so much. May I call on Marta, followed by Carola.
Gracias, señora presidenta.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm not going to be too long. I think that most of my colleagues of countries have expressed their concerns. I think we understand the general initial intent of this proposal. And sure, since the document came up like this, as it is, it requires review, redesign, clarifications. And for our constituency of the Southern Cone is concerned with the impact of this measure. In other words, how free will we be to choose the agency with which we want to work? We would like to know what impact it would have in a project, in an implementation, and when we're preparing our proposals. And also, what would happen if we have two agencies working together in one project? There is a project where we're working with two agencies, and we would like to know what the consequences would be. Thank you.
May I call on Carola, followed by Jorge.
Thank you, Nauko. For the sake of brevity, I will limit myself to saying that we feel that the proposal that's on the table is actually useful, but that we also need something on top of that. And for that, I very much agree with George and Peter earlier and many others.
Thank you. Jorge, followed by Mr. Inamov.
Gracias, señora presidenta.
Thank you, Madam Chair. We want to echo previous speakers, but we wanted to point out two issues. We believe that the study should be broader, and mainly that this was an urgent task. We need the metrics and methodology for this, so we are especially wanting to see how the FMAM7 or GEF7 funds will be used. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Inamov, followed by Ruel.
Thank you, Madam Chair. First of all, let me start with wishing patience and understanding for the representatives of the agencies, because from the very beginning of today's discussions, we started discussing the ways how the implementing agencies are working, driven by the necessity to increase the effectiveness, transparency, and result oriented. And of course, in this regard, we know that different agencies have the competitive edge in different focal areas. It is natural. For us, being at both at the donor and recipient country, it is easier to judge that some of the agencies, for example, UNID is strong in the hazardous chemicals, waste, etc., IUCN, UNEP, UNDP, strong in biodiversity, climate change, etc. So it is natural that we, the recipient countries, have their own attitude on preferring one agency or another. But at the same time, of course, when we're talking about the effectiveness of the work, the proposal to set up the ceiling of 30%, it may affect not only the so-called old implementing agencies, because we have now a bigger family of implementing agencies, and for some of them, it is the new experience. And of course, to make this demand proposal, it may lead to the situation, without my due respect to the banks, but it will lead to the situation that only huge banks, financial institutions will remain. The rest, sorry. Because in this regard, only strong financial institutions may prove that they have enough money, but they have enough money without GEF. And there is the risk that all our projects will be just for serving the credits and loans being provided by the banking institutions. We already have in the working program, which we'll be discussing later, some of the projects which are just intending just GEF grant as supplement to the loans and credits already planned or extended by the banks. But we know that the very purpose of the GEF is to serve the implementation of the environmental projects and also to stimulate the active involvement of the not only focal points but also the active involvement of the constituencies to solve the issues. And in this regard, of course, we cannot accept that this 30% ceiling will help us to increase the effectiveness of the projects we're implementing. Thank you.
Thank you. Last speaker, I'm sorry, that Mr. Luel, followed by Marita and one more. Okay. Ms.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Madam Chair, earlier today we spent quite a lot of time and energy in the discourse looking at the challenges we were faced with. And I can quickly identify three. We spoke at length about the low reporting. We spoke about the implementation challenge. We spent time debating about cancellation. And the question still begs to mind whether there is a direct correlation with the size of an agency's portfolio in GEF and their ability to implement the project. And if the answer to this is yes, and as I look at the portfolio here, then we from the Caribbean constituency think that the 30% is still too high and that it should be probably be 20 or 25% to ensure that we can have equity, but also recognizing that you have established relationships and first mover advantage. So agencies who would have already established a relationship naturally has an advantage in terms of moving in first to swoop up things as a star allocation, etc. And agencies who are now coming on board may find it difficult to get into the space. So we welcome the proposal. However, we think that the 30% is still too high.
Thank you, Marita, followed by Jos, and I'd like to close it.
Thank you, Chair, and I'm sorry to come back. I just made a short comment in the beginning, so no, I just wanted to. Was one thing I forgot to say. Since we strongly support the comments made by Aparna on country ownership and countries' right to select agencies, I think we would like to draw the attention to the work that you have done on updating the guidelines on comparative advantage of each agency, and I hope this can assist in facilitate the selection of agencies so that, because I have a feeling, and I might be wrong, but I think sometimes you select agencies by default of, the agencies that you work best with, but there may be other agencies that have a stronger comparative advantage. And hopefully these guidelines can help and facilitate that process. Thank you.
Thank you. Jos, last speaker.
And it's not because I want to be the last speaker, but there's so much confusion. In the first place that I actually went back to the policy recommendations and looked at what really happened. So you have done exactly what we asked you to do. Problem is that the section on partnership in the policy, the recommendations, contains 11 paragraphs. And the other issues have to do with other paragraphs. But paragraph 31 exactly says a proposal for updating GEF policies and procedures, including the application across all agencies of a ceiling of 30%, meaning blah, 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 blah. That's what we did. I'm still not sure that the mathematics are entirely kosher, but And I take it from the comments around the table that this is not enough when it comes to partnership. So rather than trying to accommodate somehow, I forgot in the meantime what Jos's proposal exactly was on the thing. I think what we need on the decision text, rather than trying to accommodate that, I think we have to recognize that you did the job. We have the information, it can be improved, the mathematics and so, but your suggestion of reporting regularly and asking reporting from the agencies still stands, I believe. But we would have to say something that we need to complement this with the other policy recommendations. One, so this was 31, yeah? Paragraph 30, and that's where the confusion comes from, says, GEF should ensure a level playing field for all agencies, and to this end agreed that the rules and requirements for the new GEF project agencies should be harmonized with those that apply to. So you actually put paragraph 31 under the heading of paragraph 30, and that confused everyone. But, I mean, another paragraph that also needs to be taken care of is we have, where is it? We requested you also to develop updated guidelines on comparative advantages in order to facilitate the selection process of at country level. So that's another very important element. And the other one is to monitor the geographic and thematic coverage of the agencies. That's also part of the partnership. It's also part of what we have to do. So I think, yes, you responded to one, but there's more to come. And I think that we should capture that in the decision. And I don't know if that was exactly what Jos was saying. I didn't think so. But I will keep the decision as it is, but say the Council also requests the Secretary to continue to address the other policy recommendations in relation to the partnership.
Thank you so much, everyone. I think we have spent enough time on this policy issue, but it's kind of worthwhile reflecting what kind of discussion we have had, particularly among parties to the replenishment for the entire 2 years or so. Always there is an issue of the concentration, but also there is an issue of the dependency. And there is sometimes that we mix them up or confuse themselves. And this issue actually, that it's true that always that the participants' mind is very much on the concentration issue, but also this dependency that some donors are very, very keen to really think it through. And as some of you have reflected, actually the language and policy proposal entering into the resolution is exactly this dependency language. So the paper you have in front of you is nothing new. Actually, it was first came into the Brazilian document, then it was entering into the resolution document. It was discussed actually in Da Nang, and then we shouldn't be so surprised that this is not something we wanted to hear. But that is exactly what happened. In fact, I'm kind of relieved because that I always feel that is this really what is really the policy intention on this measure? And apparently, just hearing from you, many of you actually that rightly or wrongly thought that you would like to discuss more about the concentration issue, while some of you still rightly think that dependency is important. So here is what I think we should do. I don't think that we can agree on the proposed and the adoption of this agenda today, because there are a few things we need to really think through. For instance, that as the French and the chair made it very clear that your resolution, that the contribution is really made on that particular language. That is also the French that made it absolutely clear in Da Nang. And that's one of the reasons that we have this here, so that there are donors who actually use this to secure the contribution. So we need to actually think about how we would like to respond to that. Also, you may have in mind that if we don't, unless we don't do anything, that this harmonization means that still there is a cap of 20% for some new donors and new agencies, how we want to handle that. But overall, and I hear very strongly that there is an interest on the pursuing, or say the studying more on the concentration issue, but the conclusion is not, solution is not that simple, just to switch from concentration dependency to concentration, because there is a reason that why we have this concentration. By just changing it, actually it may hurt that some of the developing countries. So it really requires a very careful thinking about, so it's not something we can switch from dependency to concentration to just for the proposal for tomorrow. So let us actually think overnight and what we could do to address some of the issues I just mentioned, that how to handle that donors who may feel very strongly that it is based on that contribution, and we need to really have a good answer to those chairs. We also need to find a good way to think about how to respond to this strong interest about a concentration issue, knowing it's not really simple to come up with a good solution. Then we need to also think about how to handle this harmonization that right now there is a cap of the 20% to those new agencies. And it's lifted? It's lifted already. Okay, so that right now I don't think that it's a good idea for us to continue like this, so that let us think that overnight we'll come back to you that how to handle those complexity, but hopefully that we can come up with some kind of a solution then hopefully tomorrow. I think that we need a bit of time to how to address those in a few issues. No. So that because of the time, and I think it's important for us to maybe to do one more program than the discussion agenda item today, so that we will lessen the burden for tomorrow. May I propose that we skip the non-grant instrument tomorrow, and then could we go into the work program discussion? I hope that we can do it in 1 hour 30 minutes, and before that 6:30 or a little after 6:30 we would like to close it. Is that okay? Yeah. All right, kind of very reluctant approval, I think. That's what I read it, but I think it's better for us to move 2 of the NGI and the work program, all of them to tomorrow. So let us go into the work program and let's see how we can come up with to conclude that session today. Thank you so much for the collaboration. All right, so let us move on to the work program. So I would like to invite Gustavo and the team to introduce the paper, the work program to you.
Thank you very much, Naoko. It's my pleasure to present to you the work program, I guess in the prime time slot of the agenda today, which is the first one in the GEF 7 cycle. As is generally the case, the first work program of any initial new cycle is relatively small, and it does not necessarily represent the overall programming directions, because it's generally quite small. Oreste, what's happening? Oh, okay. Yes, just that I can't see. Now it's fine. Thank you. The recommended work program is requesting a total of 147.2 million from the GEF Trust Fund and 10.6 million in associated agency fees. The work program contains $819.7 million in co-financing and expected co-financing, meaning that each one of the dollars that's provided by the GEF is matched by 5.6 in co-financing from other sources. Of the overall co-financing, 72%, or $592 million, was classified as investment mobilized using the terminology and the methodology coming from the recently approved policy, co-financing policy. If approved, a total of $46.5 million from the focal areas of biodiversity, climate change, and land degradation will be programmed in this work program. In addition to that, the work program includes a request of $24.3 million from the international waters focal area and $22.9 million from the chemicals and waste focal area. We also included $64 million directed to the first portion of the core grant for the small grants program. If the work program is approved as submitted, 25 recipient countries will benefit from GEF support, which includes also 4 LDCs. The SGP, in turn, is expected to benefit 107 countries. The work program contains all of the projects, and I say this again, all of the projects that were technically cleared by the deadline to constitute the work program. It also includes the first tranche of the small grants program, which takes up 41% of the resources of this work program. And this is also the first work program that benefits fully from the new gender equality policy. Finally, 6 of the 18 agents submitted PIFs to this work program. It covers a diverse set of themes ranging from promoting investment in renewable energy, managing transboundary glacier water basins, and conserving key species in terrestrial and marine ecosystems. The work program pursues objectives seeking synergies in the implementation of various multilateral conventions for which the GEF is a financial mechanism. In all, 25 recipient countries will benefit from this work program. In Latin America, in particular, is the region that has a program the highest level of resources, followed by East and Central Asia. In Africa, at similar levels, followed by Asia with $10 million. I would like to take this moment to recognize the great contribution that staff has done in the review of the PIFs, which were all considered to meet expectations on scientific soundness and technical quality, and also highlight the timely and efficient nature of the upstream consultations that we had between the staff, the GEF Secretariat, and the agencies in this process. The work program represents 4% of the total GEF 7 programmable resources, but it is contributing significantly to the GEF 7 expected results across the 10 indicators that are included in the PIFs, ranging from 15% of the GEF 7 targets for marine protected areas, in number of shared marine ecosystems under improved management, 6.4% of marine habitat under improved management, and 7% of avoidance of chemicals of global concern. The work program is also expected to produce 4.3% of the GEF 7 target for restored lands and 5.8% of terrestrial protected areas created or under improved management. So let me conclude just by saying that, bringing some interesting news from the field. New species of the black uakari monkey, shown here on your bottom right of the slide, was recently described by science. Black uakari is very close to this other red-faced uakari from the forests of the Amazon of Venezuela, Brazil, and Colombia. And it was discovered in a protected area, in a sustainable development reserve in the Amazon that has been the target of financing by the GEF. Uacaris were the subject of research by a Brazilian biologist who passed away, unfortunately, early in his career, José Márcio Aires. The species is named after him. Aires was responsible for creating this concept of sustainable development reserves, which now span 32 sustainable development reserves spanning 11 million hectares of forests, which is about the size of Liberia or Guatemala. So it's great to see that we also discovering new species, that we are protecting this patrimony that's not yet fully known. So I stop here and we'll take your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So I'd like to open the floor for questions. Mr. Inamov.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think that when we are starting the GEF7 process, all we discussed before regarding the effectiveness, transformation, result-oriented approach, etc. But when we are looking at the program, the co-financing ratio, it is 1:4. So in this regard, I think that we need to think over how we can move further on. If we're insisting and demanding from a number of constituencies to increase the co-financing, it means that we are beginning not from the proper attitude. And of course, in this regard, I look through all the projects, and a number of projects when we're putting the co-financing, usually when we're talking about the co-financing, it means that the recipient country, constituency, is declaring in written form that their readiness to co-finance. It is not only the implementing agency, which is partially taking the grant from the GEF and partially also adding the credits or loans. It means that it is not co-financing in the proper understanding. In this regard, I think that we need to think over about this program, work program, on the increasing the effectiveness of the projects which are being presented. Thank you.
Thank you. Lauren, followed by Stephanie.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for the document provided to the Council. We note that most of the projects planned in this work program are planned in upper middle income countries, including in 2 countries that are no longer ODA eligible. We would like, first of all, to know the reason why few LDCs and no SIDS are receiving any funding in this work plan. In addition, we would assume that the GEF, at the next review by the OECD DAC, will still be listed as receiving contributions that can be fully reported as ODA. Could you please confirm that this will be the case and that you are taking eventually any measures to ensure this? And we need to mention for our constituency that it's very important that 100% of our contribution to the GEF can be reported as OECD DAC, and for this reason we are in general skeptical about approving project proposals in non-ODA eligible countries. On the other hand, we are very pleased to note that 98% of the projects expect to include gender-responsive measures, but we would be interested in knowing how this will materialize and how this will be followed up by the Secretariat. In terms of the presentation, you have a table including how the projects that are approved in this work program will contribute to the core indicators. We would ask if it's possible to also present the table including the sub-indicators. I think that would be very interesting, maybe in the next work program document. We have also some comments on some specific projects, but in the interest of time, we'll just send them in writing. Thank you.
Thank you so much. May I call on Stephanie, followed by Carola.
Thank you. So I will switch in French also. Merci, Madame la
Thank you, Mrs. Chair. Thank you for this proposal. I thank the Secretariat. It is well balanced. We see the co-financing of the private sector. It's interesting. These are positive points for us. Nevertheless, we agree with Norway on the question of countries with intermediate income and above. We note that for the future, we would like to have more projects with small and medium, and also with the preceding debates, we would like that in the future work programs, during GEF 7, it would have a more balanced repartition among agencies. Thank you.
Thank you so much. May I call on Carola, followed by Yannick.
Thank you, Naoko. Completely agree with the intervention by Lauren just now. We would also like you to continue to monitor the ODA eligibility level. It's important to us to be clear on this. And we also would like to see in future work plans a stronger focus on LDCs. We noticed that for SIDS it's expected that we will see more projects next time, but what about LDCs? And we do realize that this first work plan is not representative for the full GEF 7, but at the same time, what you're presenting us now is a worrying trend for us. So we really feel obliged to make the point here that this is not what we want to see on a continued basis. So next time, at least compensate. And finally, it is important for us to get info from your side on how the work develops with a view to the results that we envisage to achieve under GEF 7, and I very much like the sheet you presented with like how much of the results is achieved. And I'd like to invite you, to put it nicely, to also share info with us on the share of climate finance that you see in these sets of projects. Thank you.
Thanks much. Yannick, followed by CSO representative.
Merci, Madame.
Thank you, Mrs. Chair. We would like to share with you 2 points. Apart from the SGP, there are 2 projects for Sub-Saharan Africa in the work program. One about Central Africa, the regional project for Victoria Lake, and the Sudan project, which is a mixed projects, GEF, LDCF. I would like to reassure the members of Council the weak representation of African projects and Central Africa in particular is due to impact projects, especially for countries for the Congo Basin. It is obvious that 6 countries are preparing their expression of interest to be candidates for the program for the Congo Basin. And we hope very much that this interest for Central Africa for GEF 7 and the impact program will be reflected in the next program in June 2019. Thank you.
May I call on CSO representative, followed by Kojura.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm from the Brazilian Rural Society in Brazil, and the CSO network appreciate the work program being proposed and would like to offer the following recommendations. The co-finance arrangement for the projects could seek to include a larger participation of co-financing from the private sector, through a more effective engagement of the private sector during the design, development, and implementation of the project. That would not only bring a strong financial framework, but also benefit the implementation, in many cases, of the project and amplify results. We notice it's indicated an amount of $2 million for land degradation project, and land degradation project plays an important role in addressing climate change challenges, and we strongly recommend a great participation of this kind of projects in the GEF 7 portfolio. We also welcome the fact that almost 50% of the funding is being directed to a small grants program, allowing faster and easier access from civil society organizations. We also recognize a broader range of small projects and initiatives offer different experiences that could be used to develop scalable and full-size projects. We also recognize it's still early in the GEF 7 funding window, and the proportion of the GEF countries assessing funding is still very low. We strongly recommend continuous efforts from the GEF to include and benefit a wider range of countries, providing a more diverse environment for exchange of experiences and impacts. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for your contribution. May I call on Kojura, followed by Stefan.
Nous accueillons le programme plutôt du FEM7 et nous reconnaissons l'équilibre des points focaux tels que proposés. Nous accueillons également le cofinancement que cela va produire. Nous sommes conscients que c'est là uniquement une petite image des programmes du FEM, mais ce qui nous préoccupe, c'est la représentation des récipiendaires, des pays récipiendaires qui ne sont pas de l'aide publique au développement. C'est un problème qui se poursuit pour nous parce que notre financement au FEM est un financement donc public pour le développement. Nous voyons également qu'il y a une représentation des agences d'exécution dans cette petite. Et nous venons d'en parler, ce n'est pas en fait ce que nous souhaitions dans le FEM7, pour le FEM7. Comme d'ordinaire, nous allons regarder les projets individuels et nous aurons davantage de commentaires par la suite.
Thank you. May I call on Stéphane, followed by
Stéphane et ensuite Laurent. Merci, Madame la Présidente. Nous remercions le secrétariat, les agences et les points focaux pour la préparation de ce programme de travail. Nous comprenons qu'il s'agit de rattraper dans une grande mesure des projets qui ont été écartés en quelque sorte du FEM6, qui étaient laissés pour compte du FEM6 et peut-être pas aussi équilibrés que nous le souhaiterions dans le programme de travail à l'avenir. Nous notons également que le PNUD a la part du lion, mais ce n'est pas uniquement parce que c'est le PNUD, mais parce que c'est le programme des petites subventions également qui se trouve dans ce programme de travail. Au nom de notre circonscription en particulier, nous accueillons l'inclusion du programme des glaciers, qui est un programme régional qui traite de l'hydrologie des glaciers dans un domaine où les questions hydrauliques sont essentielles. Donc, nous apprécions que cela ait été possible pour l'avenir. Nous avons des observations spécifiques sur des projets individuels, questions et commentaires, mais au fin de gagner du temps.
Thank you so much. May I call on Laura, followed by Paola.
Gracias, señora presidenta.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. On behalf of our constituency, we want to thank the Secretariat for preparing this work program, and also we thank the donors for contributing to this work program, making it possible to have several projects approved, especially for those areas that look at climate change, as well as for monitoring and verification within the framework of the strategy to reduce deforestation, and also in areas having to do with international waters and ecosystem-based management in Central Asia. However, we would like to highlight 2 points. One, it is important to continue to strengthen the flow of information between countries, the agencies, and the Secretariat as part of the project approval and formulation process, because this addresses several issues that we have been discussing in the last couple of days. And then secondly, regarding the small grants program, we're glad to see that 50% of the resources in the core budget have been approved. However, it is worth mentioning that in several countries, we have been working on formulating proposals using STAR resources, and we have developed national processes based on these formulations, working with different actors, with co-financing, etc. And in the future, in the near future, we hope to see these resources approved for the small grants program.
Jorge.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And just for the record, and just to signal our ongoing attention toward a well-balanced overall portfolio, which of course we will assess in aggregate at the end of the cycle. We are confident that going forward we will see more LDCs, more Africa, and also more balanced representation of implementing agencies as discussed under the previous agenda item. Thank you.
Thank you. Jorge, followed by Marta.
Gracias.
Thank you. I wanted to thank you for this work program and to say that I have a concern having to do with the targets, the different targets that are part of the table. As you know, internationally, it has been determined that there are 2 billion hectares of degraded ecosystems, and they require some sort of restoration. And COP14 made 2 decisions, L21 that calls on the General Assembly of the United Nations to declare the next decade the restoration decade, and then L23, decision L23, where it says that biodiversity and climate change are 2 nature-based results activities, one proposed by Japan, and it has to do with risk reduction, and the other is an approach that's based on ecosystems. They both aim at restoring ecosystems. So the concern is why, with this amount, why is it that the target that we have, and that has to do with the Sustainable Development Goal 15, we're talking about 13 billion for restoration by 2030. So that low goal, that low target, it seems to me really does not address what the world is presenting, what the world is calling for to deal with this. So I think that that is what is being presented by the IPCC, for example, and they are focusing on the 2.5 temperature target. So it seems to me that the target that we have set for ourselves within STAR 7 is not really consistent with the demand being placed upon us or the approach being followed by other parties. So I just wanted to point that out. I'm sure that there are going to be many projects that are going to touch on this issue, and I don't know if we're going to have a distribution of funds or are we going to resort to certain funds to address that demand. Thank you.
Followed by Ari.
Gracias, Presidenta. Le voy a pasar el micrófono, si me lo permite.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I am going to give the microphone to my colleague from Argentina. Thank you, Marta, and I thank you, Madam Chair. I want to express our appreciation for Jeff's support to the countries of our region. And this is in connection with the current work program and also looking to the future where projects are being included for countries of the region. Now, for the countries of our region, GEF support is crucial. It's not only a matter of per capita income in our countries, but it has to do with their ability to honor their international commitments as developing countries. And all of this is to be seen within the sphere of the different conventions that they have committed to. For example, just recently, we had a meeting on biodiversity, and there was clarity on how important it is for the countries of this region to deal with that challenge of lost biodiversity. And also, we saw that biodiversity impacts many aspects of our economy. So we heard a call for mainstreaming biodiversity. This is important economically, financially, environmentally. It affects transportation, infrastructure, etc. So it's very important that we continue to be able to rely on GEF's support for the projects that are presented by the countries. Thank you.
Followed by Marita.
Yeah, and the last time I shortened my name, and now I'm going to shorten my speech intervention. Well, it's actually just briefly. It's very nice to see almost half of the projects are for the regional, and then also targeting the multi-focal areas. And our constituency is really happy to see, and probably most of the recipient countries might focus on that in coming proposals. One thing I would like to highlight is the small grant program. And that is actually one of the outcome, or one of the decision the recipient countries are waiting from this council, because as I think it is the civil society made intervention saying it is exactly that we are aiming to build capacity and strengthen their involvement and partnership in order to have them with us, with the government, and to work together to fight with the environmental challenge. Thank you.
Thank you. May I call on Marita, followed by Brian.
Thank you, Naoko. We can support the work program as a whole, but I would like a couple of clarifications. First, on the distribution of the geographical distribution of the resources, it seems a bit imbalanced. I think there are good reasons for that, but it would be good if you could clarify. And also, why so few LDCs? I mean, we know that you have the SPG program in there, but in addition to that, you only have 4 LDCs. And I also noted what you said, that ongoing country dialogues with SIDS. But how much more does the Secretariat expect the LDCs and SIDS to program for the next work program? It would be good if you could update us on that. Finally, just to say we welcome the improved mainstreaming of gender equality in the work program. Thank you.
Thank you. May I go on Brian, followed by Apana?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you to the GEF Secretariat, the implementing agencies, and the countries for this first work program of GEF 7. We appreciate the Secretariat's efforts to pursue synergies in the implementation of various multilateral environment agreements for which the GEF serves as a financial mechanism. We also note with appreciation the indicative co-financing ratio of 1 to 5.6, which makes good progress towards the overall portfolio targets set for GEF 7. The United States requests that the following 4 statements be reflected in the report. Number 1, the United States, in light of its policies for certain development projects in countries whose governments are not addressing trafficking in persons, opposes the following projects and therefore does not join a Council decision that would support either. 1. The strengthening the protected area network for migratory bird conservation along the East Asian Australasian Flyway in China, or 2. Lake Victoria Environmental Management Program Phase 3 regional project that includes Burundi. Number 2, the United States, in light of its policies for certain development projects in countries which are state sponsors of terrorism, opposes the following project and therefore does not join a Council decision that would support Sustainable Natural Resources Management Project, which takes place in Sudan. 3, the United States, in light of its policies for certain development projects in countries whose governments are not addressing trafficking in persons, opposes the following project and therefore does not join a Council decision that would support the global program, GEF Small Grants Program, 7th Operational Phase, CORE, that includes China, Comoros, Congo-Brazzaville, Democratic Republic of Congo, Laos, Mauritania, and Venezuela. 4, the United States, in light of its policies for certain development projects involving countries whose governments do not have in place a functioning and transparent military audit, abstains from participating in a Council decision that would support the strengthening the resilience of Central Asian countries by enabling regional cooperation to assess high-altitude glacio-nival systems, to develop integrated methods for sustainable development and adaptation to climate change, regional project, which includes Turkmenistan. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. May I call on Apana?
And thank you, Nako. We welcome this beginning of the GEF 7 approvals and hope that the agencies will be able to obtain the CEO endorsement in time, after all the time that we have spent discussing it. So to all the agencies in the room, this is a gentle hint and reminder. Second, I am happy to also see that there are some multifocal area programs, some regional programs, etc. I look forward to the balancing of the geographies and the focal areas. 2 small points that I would like to make. One is in the expected results, I feel no result is expected for indicator number 11, number of direct beneficiaries disaggregated by gender. So since it is a cross-cutting indicator, my request will be to the Secretariat to kindly request all the 18 projects to show their gender disaggregated data of beneficiaries. And the second one is regarding the international waters, where I think we are already showing 15% of the expected targets. So whether you would like to, again, see whether the targets are appropriate. This is just mid-course correction that I suggest. All in all, congratulations on a good beginning. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Apana. I'd like to ask Gustavo and the team to respond.
Thank you very much. Thanks for very, very good constructive comments. Let me try to organize this in batches. I think we had a a series of very, I would say, coherent comments on the lack of representation of this work program, which is absolutely correct. And it's driven, as I mentioned before, by the fact that this is the first work program. To some extent, as Stefan mentioned, we are addressing projects that were under quick preparation in the GEF 6 cycle, but couldn't be funded because of shortfall issues in particular. But eventually, they made it into the GEF 7 program. They were eligible under the current strategy, and those are the ones that we have now. It also takes time for agencies and for countries to get familiarized with a new strategy. The GEF 7 strategy, as Naoko mentioned earlier on, is quite a new strategy and includes a series of impact programs that countries are busy working on expressions of interest. So it takes a bit of time to ramp up that work. And the most important, I think, reason for what we have in front of you is that these are the projects that we had in hand. These are all the projects that were technically cleared, that were available to the Secretariat at the time, and the constitution of the work program have been funded. So we didn't leave anything behind, and what we had to push forward, because I think it serves no one to hold back on projects that are ready for implementation, are ready to move forward, and these just happen to be the ones that we had. This is, of course, no excuse for inaction, and in fact, we have spent quite a lot of this staff time over the past few months since the beginning of the GEF 7 cycle on national dialogues and working with countries. We have had 21 national dialogues, and as you will understand, we have a small secretariat, but it's a very busy secretariat, and it's trying to really help countries ramp up their ideas. And of the 21, and since there were mentioned about SIDS, out of the 21 NDs, national dialogues, we had 4 in small island developed states. So, and we are expecting, for example, and there was a question of how many projects we expect from SIDS. It's difficult to determine because they need to come to us not only with the projects, but also projects that are in good technical standing. But we know, for example, that the GEF, there is a program underway, and it's called the GEF Islands under Chemicals and Waste, that's being developed, and hopefully for the June 2019 work program, which is expected to cover the Caribbean, the Pacific Islands, and the Indian Ocean. So this is one small example that we are trying to get at. We have programming discussions ongoing with Marshall Islands, Timor-Leste, Tonga, Vanuatu, and several others. So this work is ongoing, and we expect that this is going to smooth out the distribution both geographically and across agencies and thematic areas. There were some heavy loading on certain targets because, again, with what we had, but I think we are content that at least this investment is generating significant expected results on a number of fronts. And since I'm talking about results, our partner, you mentioned the question of Indicator 11. Those will come as the project gets prepared. It's hard to anticipate at this stage the number of beneficiaries that's aggregated by data, by sex, so those will come up. And that also, I think, covers a bit of the question that Lauren asked about what happens now with the policy in gender equality in place, and from the PIF on what's going to happen. So in line with the policy and the guidelines for the projects that have been approved, they need to complete a gender analysis during project preparation. And in line also with the policy, they will have to report during their midterm review on the progress on these activities and how they're dealing with that. But we also, in the meantime, launching capacity development efforts, including providing GEF guidance on gender, on online courses, and raising not only the capacity of the agencies and executing entities, but ourselves as well across the GEF Secretariat. So this work is quite busy this day, and it's going to continue. Let me touch on a difficult question, but since it was properly asked, and again, Lauren, you asked about the question of high-income countries and included in the work program. As we know, eligibility for funding is not determined in the instrument, is determined by the COP, and the COPs determine two categories of country, developed and developing countries. Developing countries are eligible to receive GEF resources. They have star allocations in the current system. So that's the situation at this stage, and that's why we have projects and we have acted on them. Let me see, what else am I missing here? Oh, yes, there was a question about sub-indicators, and sub-indicators do not have targets for GEF 7. That's one of the reasons why we're not reporting on them in the presentation here, but we can report on the ones that we have, and we'll figure out how to best point towards sub-indicators as we have it. And if I can guess, Lauren, I think you're interested in the plastics one, and we'll be happy to put some numbers on those, but with the understanding that there's no target for that, but we can monitor those numbers. I think... Yes, I did. I think if I haven't forgotten any comment, Joss, please. Did I forget?
I don't know. I wasn't here. Only part of it. No, I had a question because I heard you say that you had so far in GEF 7 21 country dialogues. Did those include the portfolio formulation exercise? And if so, to what degree? Because I mean, that's one. I'm very interested in that. That's the question.
Oh, yeah, thank you. So that maybe I will also ask the Carola to join.
Thank you, Naoko. I was still hoping to get an answer to my question about the relevance for climate financing.
Yeah, and Peter. All right. Do you want to go for?
Yes, thank you, Jossa. As you know, we decided to join the two exercises in one. All of them were mainly programming. So the discussion took place on the basis of consultations. Some of the countries had done earlier consultations and they brought them all together in the national dialogue. Others held them during the national dialogue, but they were all concentrating on the issue of how to make best use of the GEF available funds and also project ideas to a greater or lesser degree, but they all concentrated on this issue of programming. And that's why we had from the Secretariat strong presence from the programming team to help answer questions, provide guidance, whatever was requested at the time.
Yeah, just because when it comes to biodiversity, programming or considering of portfolio, do you also have the biosafety people there? Because, Gustavo, you know that this is a recurrent problem in each COP, so we've saw in all the explanations we try to say you have to coordinate. I mean, it's a question of country priority, and we can't really slice up the star allocation for Cartagena, Nagoya, Kuala Lumpur in a wildland zone. But you should coordinate, and this is, of course, if you talk about programming, is the only opportunity that the country brings together the people. I don't know what your experience is with it, but it always comes back in each biodiversity COP.
In these dialogues, the respective convention focal points are generally involved. I'm not sure if the person who deals with the protocol is either the same or if it's a different one. we don't track at that level. But we assume that there is communication at the country level, and particularly via the CBD focal point. To Carola's point, no, we have that information because we are tagging to financing to climate change. So let me look into that and get back to you on that specific one, because we haven't added up to that level. Thank you.
Mr. Inamu?
Yes, thank you. In this regard, keeping in mind the discussions and questions raised, I think that we need the new language of the proposed Council decision. Because here you are mentioning that approves the work program comprising 18 projects, but some of the projects several projects were objected totally. Some of them were questioned. That's why I propose for the Secretariat to tomorrow morning to present the language which may be acceptable, including all the discussions and questions being discussed. Thank you.
I think that if you are mentioning about Brian's comments, I think we were in agreement that yes, the US will not join that Council decision to support this and that, but he does not necessarily, stop us from approving those projects. And this is a kind of customary which the country has been doing for quite some time. So my understanding from that conversation is that we will go for the adoption of this proposal, and with footnote, actually, that the statement made by US will enter into the COCHIA's summary and recorded clearly. That is my understanding. So with that understanding, I would like to seek your approval for the proposed work program. Thank you so much, and I really appreciated you extending the working time till after 6, but then I think we had a very fruitful afternoon, full of good discussion on the reflection of the replacement process, and then thank you so much for this, and have a very good evening, and let's meet up tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. Thank you.